The private meeting room in Riyadh's royal palace glowed with golden light, the kind that seemed designed to remind visitors of power, history, and the permanence of thrones. The chandeliers hung like constellations, scattering light across marble floors that reflected every detail of the gilded walls. Guards stood at attention, their faces carved into masks of discipline, their hands resting on ceremonial swords that were more than decoration, they were reminders. The atmosphere was heavy, not with the scent of expensive oud alone, but with the quiet assertion of dominance that they, House of Saud, had perfected for generations. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, sat across from Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He was young, defiant, and utterly unfazed by the calculated opulence that surrounded him. His eyes remained steady, his posture unbending, as though he had dragged with him into this chamber not only his own presence, but that of his people, their history, and their longing for sovereignty. MBS leaned back in his ornate chair, a faint smirk curving his lips. His tone was smooth, almost playful, yet every syllable was weighted with intention. "You've made bold moves for Burkina Faso," he began, "cutting ties with old powers, building new alliances. But independence is fragile, temporary." The words lingered, sharp as the desert wind that beat against the palace walls. Traoré leaned back slightly, his face calm but edged with steel. "Temporary," he echoed. "So was every empire. History is filled with those who thought their dominance eternal, until it wasn't." For a brief moment, silence reigned. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, timeless and indifferent to thrones or crowns. The wind pressed harder, as if nature itself leaned in to listen to the duel of words. MBS's eyes narrowed, his smirk tightening into something less casual, more calculating. "You're young, Ibrahim. Youth has passion, but it often lacks foresight. Power isn't maintained by ideals alone. It requires control, trade, security, influence. Do you think you can resist forever?" Traoré's gaze sharpened. "Resist," he said. "I am not resisting. I am building. There's a difference. Resistance is defensive. Building is permanent." The prince's smirk faded, replaced with a look that belonged not to a playful monarch but to a strategist weighing an adversary. And yet every builder, MBS countered, eventually faces the storm. A small smile curved Traoré's lips, knowing, unshaken. "Then I'll face it with my people, while others face it alone in their palaces." The temperature in the room had not changed, but the tension made it feel warmer. The advisors lined along the gilded walls exchanged subtle glances, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond polite diplomacy. This was not an exchange of pleasantries. It was a duel. MBS tapped the arm of his chair thoughtfully, his rhythm slow, deliberate. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the ornate armrests, his voice lowering. "Empires fall," he admitted, his tone deliberate. "But those who control the flow of resources decide how fast they fall. Africa is rich, Ibrahim. Rich in what the world needs. Oil, gold, minerals. That makes you powerful, but also vulnerable." Traoré didn't flinch. "And yet Africa remains poor while others grow rich from what lies beneath our soil. That is not a natural order. It is a choice. A system built by those who preach partnership while tightening chains." MBS's eyes flashed, irritation mingled with intrigue. "You speak like a revolutionary. But revolutions without powerful friends burn out quickly. The West may not own you, but it can starve you. And if it does not, the markets will." Traoré's voice deepened, each word deliberate. "I am not asking the West for bread. Burkina Faso will plant its own fields, mine its own gold, and sell on its own terms. If markets close their doors, we will build our own." A sharp silence followed. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning, its mechanical steadiness contrasting with the volatility of the words exchanged. The advisors standing by the gilded doors shifted uneasily. These were not rehearsed lines. These were declarations. MBS's fingers drummed against the armrest. His eyes glinted, testing, probing. "You are confident," he said. "But confidence doesn't shield you from the wolves circling outside your borders. And they are circling, Ibrahim. Every move you make is watched by those who want you to succeed, and those who cannot afford for you to. Traoré's eyes locked on the prince's, unwavering. Then let them watch, because what they will see is not a man bowing to a throne, but a people standing on their own ground. The prince gave the faintest of nods, an acknowledgement without admission. For the briefest instant, respect flickered in his gaze before he masked it beneath composure. The heavy doors opened as attendants entered, carrying small trays of Arabian coffee, its rich aroma cutting through the tension. Neither man reached for his cup. This was not a meeting for pleasantries. This was a battlefield of philosophies. MBS broke the silence first. Ibrahim, independence is a fine word, but independence does not feed armies or build cities. You'll need investors, infrastructure, supply chains. These things do not appear without alliances. Traoré leaned forward, his voice calm but unyielding. Alliances built on equal ground, yes. But alliances where one stands tall while the other kneels? Those are chains dressed in gold. I have seen enough of them to know the cost. The prince smirked, but there was an edge to it now. Every nation kneels to someone sooner or later, even the ones that believe they're free. History proves it. History also proves, Traoré replied without hesitation, that every empire believes it is eternal, until it isn't. Independence may be difficult to keep, but empires? They have an even harder time surviving their own arrogance. The words hung heavy. The vast hall seemed smaller, as though the marble walls themselves leaned closer to absorb the weight of the exchange. For a moment, MBS studied him, not as a naive African leader, but as a man who had chosen to confront history head-on. Respect, fleeting but real, passed over his features, before vanishing behind the trained composure of a crown prince. You are bold, he said finally. That will make you dangerous to some, and useful to others. I am not here to be useful, Traoré answered. I am here to make sure the next generation of my people never has to ask permission to stand. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped lower over Riyadh's skyline. The towers cast long shadows across the desert, as though time itself leaned toward dusk. Both men knew this meeting would end with a handshake for the cameras, but its consequences would echo far beyond the palace walls. MBS rose from his chair, gesturing toward the balcony. Come, he said. I want you to see something. They stepped into the warm evening air. Below them stretched Riyadh, a city transformed into a monument of ambition. Glass towers reflected the last rays of sunlight. Construction cranes dotted the horizon, and wide avenues pulsed with traffic. This, MBS declared, sweeping his hand across the skyline, is what vision and capital can build. 10 years ago, much of this was sand. Now, it is the future. Traoré's eyes scanned the horizon, acknowledging the transformation. Impressive, he admitted. Then, after a pause, but tell me, how many of those towers belong to your people? And how many to those who rent your land while taking the wealth elsewhere? The question struck with surgical precision. MBS did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened. Ownership is complicated, he said at last. Partnerships drive progress. Without them, the pace slows, and the world moves fast. Traoré rested his hands on the marble railing, his gaze unshaken. Sometimes moving slower means you actually arrive. Sometimes chasing speed only leads you in circles, faster and faster, until you collapse. The prince's expression hardened, the faintest crack in his carefully composed demeanor. And what happens if you refuse to play the game? The world does not wait for those who step aside. Traoré's lips curved into a faint, defiant smile. Then we will build a world that plays by our rules instead. Behind them, the palace staff exchanged uneasy glances. They could sense this was not a typical diplomatic exchange. This was the clash of visions, of two leaders testing not just policies, but the very foundations of how nations survive. The evening deepened, stars beginning to prick the desert sky. But on that balcony, two men stood at the edge of history, their words carving futures yet unseen. The night had settled over Riyadh, yet the palace glowed as if refusing to surrender to darkness. Golden lanterns lit the courtyards, their light dancing across carved arches and polished marble. Inside, the air was filled with the aroma of saffron, roasted lamb, and cardamom tea. But beneath the fragrance, beneath the elegance, lay something denser, tension that no incense could mask. Traoré sat at a long dining table, the silver platters gleaming under soft chandeliers. MBS sat across from him, the distance between them more than physical. Advisors filled the edges of the room, their silence a wall around the duel that had not ended with the balcony. MBS sliced slowly into his lamb, his voice calm, but the edge unmistakable. "I've met many African leaders," he said. "Most understood one thing. Survival means compromise. You speak as if you can stand apart from the currents of the world. That is not bravery, Ibrahim. It is naivety." Traoré set his fork down deliberately, his eyes locked on the prince's. "And I've met many powerful men," he replied, "who believed wealth insulated them from reality. But tides always come in, Your Highness. Empires think themselves permanent, until they are not." The words fell heavy, silencing even the faint clatter of silverware. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft rustle of servants moving discreetly, pouring water, laying bread, retreating as quickly as shadows. The prince chuckled softly, though his eyes were sharp. "So you believe Burkina Faso will outlast the kingdom of Saudi Arabia?" Traoré leaned forward, voice steady, unwavering. "I believe a nation built on self-reliance and unity can outlast any empire built on fear and dependency. It is not about the size of your army or the depth of your treasury. It is about whether your people would still stand with you, if all that vanished tomorrow." A silence followed, denser than before. MBS's gaze sharpened, the kind of gaze that had measured billion-dollar deals, dismantled rivals, and silenced dissent. Yet here was a man from a nation far smaller, far poorer, who did not blink. "You talk of unity as if it were a shield," MBS said at last. "But predators do not respect shields. They respect power." "Power without principle," Traoré answered, "is just another form of weakness. And weakness, no matter how well it dresses, eventually falls." One of the Saudi advisors shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the two men. He could sense what few dared acknowledge, that this conversation was cutting, beyond protocol, carving into raw truths that rarely surfaced in gilded halls. MBS leaned back, swirling his glass of tea. His smile was faint, his words careful. "You speak boldly, but the world is not forgiving of leaders who mistake defiance for strategy, sanctions, economic isolation, media campaigns to paint you as a tyrant. Do you think you can walk through that storm untouched?" "I do not expect to walk untouched," Traoré replied. "I expect to walk standing." For a moment, the two men stared across the table, the candles flickering between them like the thin line between two worlds. Then the music began, oud strings and soft drums, weaving through the courtyard beyond the walls. Yet neither man listened. Their duel continued beneath the rhythm, silent but unrelenting. The next morning, Riyadh woke under a sun that turned its towers into golden mirrors. The motorcades glided through wide boulevards, past palm-lined avenues, toward one of the kingdom's most ambitious projects. Traoré stepped out onto a platform, overlooking the construction of a new city, a future built from desert sand. Cranes stretched across the skyline, workers moved in swarms, and the sound of progress filled the air. MBS walked beside him, gesturing toward the vast landscape being reshaped by billions of dollars. "This," he said, his voice carrying pride, "is what happens when leadership meets limitless resources. We build not just for today, but for centuries." Traoré's eyes traced the towers rising from the sand, then drifted to the workers laboring beneath the scorching sun. Sweat darkened their clothes, dust clung to their skin. Many were migrants, faces from South Asia, Africa, and beyond. "It is impressive," Traoré admitted. Then, after a pause, "But I wonder, how much of this belongs to the people who live here? And how much belongs to the crown?" MBS's jaw tightened. His voice was measured, but there was steel beneath it. "It belongs to the nation. In my country, the crown is the nation." Traoré's gaze did not waver. "In my country, the nation is the people. The leader is only their voice, and voices are not owned." The words hit like a hammer against marble. For a moment, even the desert wind seemed to pause. "You think your model will outlast mine?" MBS asked, folding his arms. Traoré didn't hesitate. I think my model will survive without me. That is the point. The comment caught the prince off guard. Leaders like him, accustomed to consolidating power, rarely heard such words. For them, the state and the throne were inseparable. The idea of building something that could outlive the leader himself was almost alien. MBS's smirk faded briefly before returning sharper, almost like a blade. You speak as though destiny is already secured. Traoré looked out at the desert, his voice steady. It is secured because it does not belong to me alone. The wind swept across the platform, carrying grains of sand between them. Two visions of power clashed silently in the dry air, one rooted in central authority, the other in collective resilience. That evening, the palace prepared a private dinner in a secluded courtyard. Golden lanterns swayed in the warm desert air. Musicians played soft melodies, their notes mingling with the aroma of spiced vegetables and roasted meat. Every detail was calculated to impress, to remind the guest that Saudi wealth could dress even the desert in abundance. MBS raised his glass. To partnerships that can change the future. Traoré mirrored the gesture, his gaze steady. To futures decided by the people who will live in them. The subtle tension threaded through the night like a second melody, quieter but more piercing than the music. I admire your defiance, MBS said, leaning forward. But history is not kind to nations that turn away from powerful allies. Independence is admirable. Alliances are survival. Traoré took a slow sip, his reply calm. Survival without dignity is not life. It is captivity. My people choose freedom, even if the path is harder. The courtyard fell silent except for the distant notes of the musicians. MBS studied him, his expression unreadable, as though measuring the weight of his words against the weight of centuries. Perhaps you are not the leader I expected, the prince said finally. Most come here seeking wealth, power, or favor. And yet you invited me anyway, Traoré replied. His lips curved into the faintest smile. Perhaps you wanted to see if I could be moved. MBS allowed a small laugh, softer this time, more genuine. Or perhaps I wanted to see if you could move me. The admission hung between them, unexpected, almost disarming. Beneath rivalry, there was a trace of respect. The evening ended without agreement, but not without understanding. Neither man yielded his vision, but both recognized the other's resolve. The lanterns flickered in the desert breeze as the music drifted higher. Above, the night sky glittered with stars, older and more enduring than any crown or empire. The next morning, as Traoré prepared to leave Riyadh, the palace courtyard filled with ceremony. Cars lined in perfect order, guards at attention, cameras waiting to capture the moment. MBS walked forward to see him off. The smirk returned, though thinner now, sharpened. Your independence is temporary, he said, repeating the line from their first meeting. Traoré stepped closer, his voice calm but firm, each word a blade. So was every empire. For a moment, the smirk faltered. The exchange was short, but it carried the weight of centuries. Both men knew those words would echo far beyond the palace gates, across continents, into the ears of allies and adversaries alike. As Traoré's motorcade rolled through the desert roads toward the airport, he gazed out at the endless sand. It stretched like time itself, swallowing kingdoms, swallowing empires. He thought of all the leaders who had once believed their thrones eternal, and how the desert remembered none of them. The plane lifted into the sky. Far below, Riyadh's towers gleamed in the sun. Far ahead, Ouagadougou awaited. At the airport, crowds had already gathered, waving flags, chanting his name. They didn't know every word spoken behind golden doors, but they saw in his eyes that he had not bent. He had not sold their future for comfort. When he stepped out, the chants grew thunderous. He raised his hand, speaking into microphones carried on the wind. We will not trade our dignity for anyone's approval. We will shape our destiny, not as guests at someone else's table, but as hosts at our own. The cheers rolled across the capital like a tide, filling streets and homes, embedding itself into the nation's heart. And somewhere, in the gilded halls of Riyadh, MBS sat in silence, perhaps realizing that some leaders cannot be bought, cannot be broken. Nations are not defined by the power they borrow, but by the strength they refuse to surrender. The hall in Riyadh had turned into a furnace of silence. Traoré stood unflinching, his gaze locked on MBS, who had abandoned his rehearsed smiles. Cameras caught the weight of history balancing on a single breath. "You wanted loyalty," Traoré said, voice steady. "But what the world needs is truth." The words struck sharper than any weapon. MBS lowered his eyes, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of a battle he could no longer control. As Traoré walked away, the air shifted, a reminder that resistance could echo louder than empires.